The views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the participants and do not reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
BronxNet. Your voice, your views, your vision.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. Recently, there were 4 publicized incidents where people of color who had legally shopped at 2 of New York's most well-known stores, Barney's and Macy's, were stopped and frisked and even, in some cases, handcuffed and taken into a precinct because of suspicion that they had stolen items that they actually legally purchased. This opens up, obviously, a number of disturbing issues about racism, about police tactics, about the relationship between corporate America and the legal community, and much more. There's also legislation being proposed by 2 Bronx legislators to address the problem. Shop and frisk. That's our topic tonight. If you'd like to join in the dialogue, maybe even tell of your own experiences in this regard, then call in at 718-960-7241. You can also email questions or comments to us at BronxTalk@hotmail.com, and we'll read those on the air during a future edition of our program. In the studio tonight, 2 Monroe College criminal justice professors, one a former NYPD detective who runs his own security consulting company, Professor Robert Gibbons. Good evening. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Gary.
And also a professor at Monroe and Fordham, who's a clinical social worker. Welcome back, Professor Edgar Tyson. We appreciate your joining us tonight.
Good to be back.
And also we'll be joined by Assemblyman Louis Sepulveda, who will talk about his proposed legislation. Gentlemen, it's to me a very disturbing issue. It seems rather remarkable that somebody could do something legally and with no problem do something that we all do, go shop, maybe make a large purchase, and then literally get stopped and frisked, or shop and frisked afterwards. Professor Tyson, let's start with you. Why do these things happen? Innocent people being frisked after having their credit cards approved seems ridiculous.
Well, Gary, this is a part of a larger set of issues that many in social service, social work field, and sociology, psychology have been studying for decades. It is part of an experience called microaggression. For example, if a store owner following a customer of color around in the store, a white person who's waiting to ride the next elevator when a person of color takes the elevator, a white woman or man clutching their purse or checking their wallet as a black or Latino approaches or passes. This is just a part of a long history of very well understood ideas coming out of human rights and social justice literature and research, referred to as microaggression. Mm-hmm. And people of color, people of alternative gender or sexuality, sexual orientation, have been dealing with this for decades.
Is it a matter, solving it from the basic level, a matter of education, and can it be taught in schools? Is it something that happens in the home? Do you have to see it on TV like this show to correct behavior? How do we begin to correct this kind of fear and suspicion and this sort of thing from happening long term?
Well, number one, you have to recognize that people harbor either intentionally or non-intentionally. And that's the thing I want to get across. Most microaggressions actually are unintentional. It's when you see a Spanish person and they're talking very good English and you say, oh, but aren't you Spanish? Or if you see a black person talking very articulately, oh, you're very articulate, as if that is a surprise or a complete anomaly. And we have to recognize that we have to begin to get rid of these old, very outdated views of each other that are based, quite frankly, in racist undertones that still exist today.
And obviously the extension of that is when you go into a store and then somebody makes a purchase, as I mean, I can look up some of the instances. A 21-year-old nursing student from Canarsie bought a $2,500 designer bag from Barney's. After she left the store, she was descended on by police officers. They allegedly pushed her up against the wall, demanding an explanation how she could have afforded to pay for it, questioning our ownership of what was a legitimate credit card. That's an extension of what you're talking about. Professor Gibbons, this to me seems remarkable. A store has the ability to check on that credit card before the purchase is made, as we all have gone through that very easy and very obvious validation process. Somebody gets their card validated. How in the world can anybody in either the legal community or store security think they have the right then to say, wait a minute, because you're a person of color, you couldn't have really had a legitimate card?
Well, Gary, according to the CEO of Barney's, Mark Lee, he unequivocally absolves them in the store from any wrongdoing. Okay.
Yeah, they said no. None of our employees was involved. This was an NYPD
right.
thing.
And you know, being part of an organization for so many years and trying to do the best you can, I find this extremely alarming and hurtful for communities, as the professor just explained, and expanding on it moving forward, like to move past this. But you know, people seem to forget very early on in Ray Kelly's first tenure, his mandate was policing, community policing. And he had policies in place, park, walk, and talk policy. Every twice a tour, the sector team would park their radio car, get out for a half-hour walk around, and specifically have to log in the interactions they had with the community members, people walking the street, bus drivers, post office, and the retail stores. So the Attorney General uses a term called that the police department and the retail stores in cahoots, which I find offensive.
Well, let's just go back to that. So that community policing concept, which, and I recall because we talked about it on this show for a long time, was seen as a very good thing.
Great
Do you
thing.
think we've gotten away from that over the course of the time that he's been commissioner?
Well, his second turnaround, his mandate now is stop, question, and frisk. So he went from being the community police commissioner to now being the crime fighter strategy police commissioner. But in his first turn, what we seem to forget was the best source of communication, the information highway, was coming from the people themselves in the retail stores.
And so now, I don't think there's any, I'm making an assumption here that's not correct. Now there's no question that relationship certainly has fragmented.
Absolutely.
So when we get to a situation where this happens, does the store pick up the phone and call the NYPD and say, hey, I've got somebody here, I think they're fraudulent?
100% positive, absolutely.
That happens.
That's what happened. Absolutely. I was part of the process for years.
And did it happen because they saw somebody in front of them, or there's somebody outside the store, or even a plainclothes person in the store that they contact? What's that process?
Well, what happened, sources close to me tell me with the Barney's incident with this unfortunate young man who was stopped, evidently the credit card in question had a female's name on it. So when he presented the credit card, there was some checks done on it. But, you have to be careful. It's a very sensitive topic.
Absolutely.
So let the purchase go through, but meanwhile, someone is phoning the local switchboard
but I don't
to respond to the location.
If they had a question about the validity of the credit card,
they should have turned it down.
They should turn down the credit card.
I agree with you. I agree with you.
And Professor Tyson, does this come back to the thing that they were afraid to turn down the credit card of a person of color?
It could very well be, which is a microaggression in itself. I mean, to think that you were going to be punched in the face because you turned down a credit card is
I was just about to say, now I've got a bigger problem than the one I started with.
If I may, Gary, just
of course.
What the professor just said here is important because, rule one of making a mistake, whether it be public sector, private sector, big corporation, is get out from under it and admit the wrong.
Right.
And Mark Lee had an opportunity to admit the wrong and take responsibility. Right. He didn't make the wrong, and he didn't accept responsibility, which leads to his explanation perfectly.
And what responsibility does the NYPD have? And I'm going to lay something out here, and you've already started the dialogue on this, and that is that it's and actually Professor Tyson did as well. It's actually an extension of stop and frisk. If the idea is out there that you can take anybody really and say, you know what, I think maybe you've got a problem of some sort, and then you can take them as far as handcuffing them and bring them into the station house without any real legitimate reason for doing so, one would think this is the next extension of it.
Sure. I mean, let's be perfectly honest. Retail stores have extreme theft prevention measures in place all the time. And they're expanding on it and tightening up just as much as police departments are. But the comfortable relationship has been there, and it's going to last. And for example, the police department, will write a policy, and the policy will go into place. And the executive staff rolls that policy out through the lower ranks.
Is it in writing? Those kinds of policies?
I don't have facts in front of me, but I will say that throughout meetings which I've attended, and I'm sure that you've had on your show, crime strategy meetings, the UF 250 has come up as a mandate about recording the stops. Are we stopping the quality person? What are we doing as a result of this? For example, why are you so low and they're so high? What's the dynamics of this stop? So now as it trickles down through the ranks, as I was a commander of a detective squad, we would use the information coming in as a tool to solve investigations for crime trends and patterns. We weren't actually doing the stops.
But, go ahead.
So
finish that.
What happens is, if I find it funny that interesting that like in the 23rd precinct, where they have one of the most stops in the city, the precinct commander is a person.
Where is that precinct?
Spanish Harlem area.
Okay.
The precinct commander is someone of color.
Interesting.
So, like, what happens if
makes me turn to my friend Professor Tyson?
What happens if he doesn't adhere to the policy in place? Well, is your career in jeopardy? Is there a draconian discipline drop down on you?
So one of the things you told me before, and by the way, we are going to get Assemblyman Sepulveda on the phone, who has the legislation that we want to talk about as well. But one of the things you mentioned before is that this comes down from above.
Yeah.
That the mandate is there. Come up with numbers, make sure, and that is kind of their, you called it research, that is their investigative strategy to find, solving crimes.
In a paramilitary organization, you fall in line, and whatever mandate comes down, you follow the orders and you carry them out as deemed fit.
Professor Tyson, you wanted to weigh in on the notion that a person of color may be the commander of a precinct that does the most stop and frisks.
This is probably one of the most troublesome aspect of racism, where in today 2013 you will have, it is quite normal actually and natural for you to see people of color committing these microaggressions on other people of color, because it is a mentality that suggests that some people based on their class, race and gender are a threat and others aren't.
Is it almost that they've crossed the line and now they feel they're in a position of authority? So in a way, I hate to use this phrase, they lose their blackness, or they forget where they're from because of that power corrupts, so to speak?
Absolutely.
Now, I'm not saying in the case of this commander, but I'm just saying in general.
No.
Let us go to the phone. Assemblyman Louis Sepulveda, nice to have you with us on the show, sir. Assemblyman, what are you proposing, along with Senator Ruben Diaz Sr., to address this issue?
Well, Gary, first of all, thank you for having me on. But just to touch on my experience, we organized a rally in front of Parkchester, in the Macy's in front of Parkchester, and I got calls from several representatives at Macy's. They were essentially trying to dissuade me from having the rally. And one of the most disturbing things that I experienced was that during our conversations, they wanted to blame the NYPD. They refused to accept responsibility for the store's policy. And that was troubling and that was insulting. And I basically told them, if you're calling me here to tell me that there's no problem, that Macy is not responsible for the shop and frisk policy, then there's no point of us having this conversation. And to this day, and I understand that the CEO of Barney is taking the same position, it's disgraceful that they would stand there and speak to a legislator and tell them that there's no issue here, that it's really the NYPD, and it looks like what they're attempting to do now is to blame the NYPD and not accept responsibility. I mean, why does Macy's have a holding cell at 34th Street if this is not part of their policy?
Assemblyman, hold on one second. I do want to ask Professor Gibbons about this. Does the NYPD have the right to come into the store without being called when there's no incident, to just kind of like be on patrol, as it were, in case they suspect somebody of shoplifting or something else.
Sure. I mean, Gary, a lot of times observation is developed from the street. So in Midtown, it's not uncommon to pick up on a team of people who are trying to do pickpockets.
Yes, but that's in the street. I'm talking about, can they walk into a private business? They can do that.
Yes, because if
even without suspicion, just in general?
Yeah, if they're following a team of pickpockets, it's actually quite the norm in some of these major retail stores as well, because they're going to look out for the patrons inside to see how these people interact and see if they're picking their pockets. But if I may just lend on something what he said, the police department has a policy with these retail stores who are in total denial of what's going on. It's a retail store apprehension team. They have a borough van assigned to go around twice a tour to pick up store arrests.
So to pretend that it's not a relationship, an association between the police department and the stores is
it's the most insulting thing ever. It's like we just fell off the turnip truck.
Assemblyman, let's talk about your legislation.
Well, Gary, one of the ways to stop this policy is to hit them in their pockets. Remember that people of color spend billions and billions of dollars at retail stores, and make them aware of what's going on. Now, one of the practices that these retail stores engage in is that a lot of times people will stop and they are frightened, and so they agree to pay a fine, and they agree to pay for the merchandise that they've already paid for. And what happens is they go to court, they are then acquitted of any charges, and then the department stores, the retail stores, still go after them. Now, there's this underground business, well, not underground, but there's this industry where the retail store sells the right to collect these fines and collect on the merchandise to a third party.
That's unbelievable.
Third parties are extremely aggressive about collecting against these people that have been acquitted of all charges.
You know this for sure? This is a common practice?
It's a very common practice.
You've shocked both my guests, and believe me, they've heard everything. It's not so easy to do. So what is your proposal here?
The bill that both Senator Diaz and I are proposing is that if in a situation where the individual is acquitted of all charges, the retail stores or any of these third parties are prohibited from attempting to collect for the merchandise and the penalties that they agree to pay at any time once the individual is found not guilty of any charges. And this stops this third-party business. It stops the retail stores from benefiting from this, because remember, even though the third party is collecting, the retail store gets a percentage of that, and so it hits them. It stops this terrible industry that targets people of color.
It's an interesting thing, and the specifics of the legislation are very interesting to me. But as a person of media and likes to feel about what people think and feel, to me, the fact that you're talking about it now on TV and even just bringing this notion up is a good thing, because it begins to bring the problem to light. I believe it has the ability to change minds. Assemblyman, before we let you go, is there anything else you wanted to add to the conversation?
Well, we're going to continue. I mean, I was so insulted by the position that Macy's took that we're going to continue to hold rallies and expose the practices of these retail businesses and make sure that our communities are aware of it. Parkchester, in my district, has a Macy's, and we're not going to let up until they stop this policy and that we're satisfied that they're going to engage in practices that treat communities of color with the respect that they deserve and with the buying power that they have.
Right. Assemblyman, thank you very much. Professor Tyson, go
ahead. I wanted to just sort of piggyback on what the Assemblyman said in terms of this particular issue. A lot of people in the community are actually calling upon people of color and anyone who supports them in this effort to stop spending their money at these locales, because that is the way to put a dent in this and to stop this. If we stop spending our money there, then they're going to have to change their policy.
It will be interesting. Professor Gibbons talked about the Attorney General. It'd be interesting to see how far they go. One thing I want to ask you, and then we're going to take a phone call, which, again, frankly, it doesn't happen to me, but as I talked with a number of people about this issue, even the dean at the Monroe College School of Criminal Justice said her mom had been followed in the store. Apparently, this is a very common thing, this whole notion that if you see somebody different, people get followed in the store.
Well, if you recall, maybe not, but there was a big sort of societal response to Oprah Winfrey when she said when she was in Switzerland buying, I don't know what it was, $100,000 bag, $150,000, whatever it was, she was approached as if she could not afford it and was not shown certain bags. So this is not something that is unusual.
Professor Gibbons, from a crime fighting and a crime prevention perspective, taking the other side of the coin here, don't we have sympathy for any store owner, not only Macy's and Barney's, but a small store owner who says, you know what, I got to make sure the stuff doesn't disappear, and if I think I'm suspicious of somebody, I'm going to watch them extra carefully. Now, unfortunately, it may come down to an innocent person who's a person of color, but on the other hand, isn't there some sympathy for them saying, you know what, we're going to follow anybody we think may be suspicious?
Sure. I mean, Gary, no one goes into business to lose money.
Of course.
But I found through over my vast experience with NYPD, it's the larger, multi-state organizations and companies that really step away from it. The cooperative level on the smaller retail or the mom and pop shops has been fantastic. Historically, they're on board with what, they do crime prevention surveys from the local precinct. The community police officer goes by. The precinct sector car stops and they're big 911 callers
so
as opposed to handling it themselves.
Multi-state large corporations that are out of touch with what community.
Which is kind of in sync with what the Assemblyman just said about, hey, sue me.
Yeah. We have Mark from Pelham Parkway, who's one of our regular guys. How are you, Mark? Nice to have you on the show.
Hey, Gary. It's a pleasure to be back. Gentlemen, professors, I think what we're looking at here is something that's systemic, that goes back to how we've marginalized the Constitution of the United States to begin with. You have cases where the NSA is listening on everyday citizens that aren't even accused of anything. Now, trickle it down to what's happening. Years ago, police officers could not work in security work. The only thing they did was banks would hire them as tellers, even though they couldn't count over 20 because they run out of fingers and toes because they had a gun. Now, I've seen in a lot of high-end stores, and I wouldn't be a bit surprised if Barney has this, where the city now leases out police officers in uniform for security in stores. And that could be a conduit where a police officer sees somebody leaving and calls up his buddies on the walkie-talkie. And that could be part of the
Very, very interesting. Mark,
let me finish. The thing that offends me most of this is that how everybody's pointing the finger at each other. The stores are pointing it at the police department. I hope they both get sued, and I hope they take it through court so they can be depositions, because that's the only way you'll ever find out the real truth about this.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your comment. That's one of the, Mark has been on the show a ton of times. That's one of the best things he ever said. What about this notion of police officers who may, and you now are retired but working in security, but yes, they are.
The paid detail unit is
moonlighting.
Utilized. It's an organized program through the NYPD.
Does this help or hurt this particular issue? No effect.
I think it provides a sense of security inside the office. The uniform speaks volumes. It could also give the delusion of that there's actually police in the store walking around. It might work as a deterrent against criminals.
Right.
But is it going to change the way the corporations like Barney's operate?
Yeah. When he said what offends me about this, all of this offends me. I'm sorry. Everything about this offends me. Is there is your sense, and I realize we're getting to a political thing here, but is your sense with the new mayor and potentially a new police commissioner that we're in for a tactical review and a tactical change when it comes to the NYPD? Or is, and right now the courts are debating stop and frisk, is that really going to be the way that the police department operates?
Well, I believe strongly in some of the words that the mayor-elect has said, that he's going to go in a different direction. He's made that change himself.
Will it make crime, if they do, will it make crime fighting less effective?
That's a tough call. I mean, I think you're going to see some crime statistics go up and down like they normally do. I do think you're going to see a change in the strategy, the way the New York City Police Department operates. I think you're going to see a more community-based policing atmosphere, which in turn will set the tone on how the NYPD will move forward.
I have to tell you, I'm still stuck on this notion that somebody makes a legal purchase and they didn't stop the credit card at the moment when the review happens. We all have had it, and occasionally they say, I'm sorry, you have to use a different card or whatever, and they don't stop it then, but then something is happening and somebody is stopped afterwards. That, I just can't figure that out.
Do you ever turn down the money? I mean, I'd love to have Mark Lee in front of us.
Oh, that's interesting.
Are you going to pass up $300+?
Or in some cases, $2,500.
And then notify the big bad NYPD to do your muscle for you?
That's a very interesting thing.
Yeah.
Professor Tyson, I want to talk about the classroom a little bit, and not only the college classroom that you gentlemen work in, but way back when we were all in school, we were taught about justice. We were taught about what the country means. We were taught what Mark said about the Constitution of the United States. You have been on the show for Stop and Frisk, for the Trayvon Martin case, and now for Shop and Frisk. How do we teach this now? How do we teach the notion of justice in our schools so that people get a real education, young people get a real education, and number two, they have a little confidence in the country and not grow up thinking, you know what, everybody's against me. Maybe everybody is.
Well, we really got to start looking at each other real honestly and talking about some of these fears, Gary. Instead of playing and passing the buck around and saying, like the assemblyman said, pointing the finger. I think it was the caller, Mark, who said there's a lot of finger pointing. And first person you have to look at yourself. Look at yourself and say, do I harbor any racist or sexist or heterosexist viewpoints, and how has that impacted my relationships with other people? Because that's where it starts. It starts with the individual making an assessment of who am I to look at a person and pass judgment about whether they can pay for something or whether they should be in an area or shouldn't be in an area.
Yeah. Here's what's disturbing. I mean, I'm in total agreement, of course, with what you're saying, but here's what's disturbing to me is what Professor Gibbons said, and that is that the problem is not necessarily in the relationships between the people, certainly in the Bronx, where we, I think, accept you have to accept diversity or you may as well go somewhere else. But the problem is really at a very high level, at a corporate level. That's where the problem is. And so while I'm in complete sympathy with what you're saying, but boy, there's factors out there that are a lot larger than these interpersonal relationships.
Well, these people come from somewhere, right?
Fair enough.
They were little kids too, and they just carry on without any lessons learned.
Professor Gibbons, I'm going to give you the final word here. And so the question is, what has to happen right now, aside from the legislation proposed? What would you like to see?
Well, I think, as you touched on, this is an extension of Stop, Question, and Frisk, and not to exhaust the topic here, but great tool, misused, hands down.
I agree.
I think the word is out on the street that the policy's in place, the police department's taking a beating over it, so it spills over into the retail world and the major corporations. There has to be a level of accountability at the executive level within an organization, be it Barney's, be it the New York City Police Department. Instead of shuffling the chairs around and offering people these things, you have to take responsibility at that level.
Is the state attorney general the person maybe to bring it to the fore if he can do it? Is that how we're going here?
I don't know. Reading his statement, he seemed a little,
He probably didn't want to say anything yet.
He got caught in his own words, I think, using terms.
Professor Robert Gibbons, Professor Edgar Tyson, both from Monroe College School of Criminal Justice, thank you very much. As things come up, we'll bring you back.
Great, thanks.
You know how it goes. And folks, if you have further comments or questions on anything you heard on tonight's show or anything going on in the Bronx, then email them to us at bronxtalk@hotmail.com. We'll post them on our Facebook page, and we'll read those on the air during a future edition of our program. Also, please become a fan of our show, Bronx Talk, on Facebook. You can see our archives at bronxnet.org, and we're right at the bottom right-hand navigation bar. You can check out the Bronx Talk link there. Next week, we'll be joined by the lame duck controller. John Liu will be on the show to make his last appearance while still in office. We'll talk politics, the challenges ahead for the new mayor and controller, and a number of other important issues. November 25th, an exclusive show about a slave burial ground in Hunts Point, something you will only see here on Bronx Talk. And then make a note, a couple of weeks later on December 9th, Borough President Ruben Diaz Jr. will be on the show. That's all. See you next week.